Your brother owes $460,000. My dad slammed his fist on the heavy mahogany dining table. You are paying it for him, or you are no longer our child. I looked at my parents, then at my brother, and finally said, then I am not. I walked out and called my bank right after. 3 days later, my entire family showed up at my doorstep with their luggage, expecting to move in. I opened the door, smiled, and said, too late. My name is Danielle. I am 33 years old and a corporate financial auditor. Before I get into the details of how I legally dismantled my toxic family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to set a hard boundary with relatives who underestimated your worth and your intelligence. Growing up, my parents always made it explicitly clear that my brother Brandon was the priority. I was just the backup plan, the scapegoat expected to clean up his messes. That reality hit its absolute peak this past Thanksgiving. The dining room of my parents' home was exactly as it had been for decades. Heavy wooden furniture, expensive crystal glasses, and the overwhelming scent of roasted turkey and sage stuffing. But the tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. We had barely finished the appetizers when my father Thomas reached into his tailored suit jacket. He did not pull out a holiday card or a heartfelt toast. He pulled out a thick stack of stapled legal papers and slammed them directly onto my porcelain dinner plate. The documents landed with a heavy thud, knocking over my water glass and soaking the expensive lace tablecloth. I did not flinch. I just looked down at the bold red letters stamped across the top page. It was a notice of foreclosure. I looked up at my father, waiting for an explanation. Thomas cleared his throat, adjusting his tie with hands that were visibly shaking. He looked at Brandon, who was 30 years old, but currently staring down at his mashed potatoes like a scolded toddler. Your brother has run into some unforeseen business complications, my father said, using his best authoritative voice that he always used to intimidate me. His cryptocurrency startup has failed entirely. He has accumulated $460,000 in debt to a ruthless private equity firm. They are calling in the loans today, Danielle. I placed my napkin on the table, keeping my voice completely level and devoid of emotion. And what does a foreclosure notice on your house have to do with Brandon failing at his crypto business? Carol? My mother let out a dramatic sigh, pressing a perfectly manicured hand to her chest. We had to help him, Danielle. He is your brother. We took out a secret second mortgage on this house to give him the capital to save his company. But the market crashed, and now the bank is foreclosing on our home. We are defaulting. The sheer audacity of their financial illiteracy washed over me in waves. As a corporate auditor, I spend my days tracking millions of dollars in corporate fraud and analyzing complex financial structures. Hearing my parents admit they illegally leveraged their home equity to fund a failing crypto scam was almost comical. I looked at Brandon. He remained completely silent, letting his parents fight his battles, just like he always did when we were kids. But his wife Jasmine was not silent. Jasmine is 29 years old, identifies as a luxury lifestyle influencer, and was currently wearing a Cartier love bracelet that I now realized was likely funded by my parents' second mortgage. She leaned forward, adjusting her designer silk top, and let out a loud, condescending smirk. Look, Danielle, Jasmine said, rolling her eyes as if I were the one being unreasonable. It is your duty to help out. You are the single childless sister. You have a massive corporate salary and no real responsibilities or family of your own. What else are you even using your money for? You need to liquidate your investment portfolios and pay this off so we can all get back to normal. My parents nodded along to Jasmine and her ridiculous statement, as if it were a perfectly reasonable request. They genuinely believed that my years of working 60-hour weeks climbing the corporate ladder and meticulously building my wealth were all just a waiting fund for my brother and his inevitable failures. They expected me to drain my life savings to bail out a grown man who refused to even look me in the eye. I looked right at Jasmine, noting her fresh salon blowout and the immaculate makeup she had done for her latest social media vlog. I am not liquidating a single dime, I said clearly and firmly. My money is mine. You and Brandon can figure out how to pay back the private equity firm, and Mom and Dad can figure out how to deal with the bank. I am entirely out of this. The moment those words left my mouth, the fake, polite Thanksgiving atmosphere shattered into a million pieces. Carol immediately burst into performative tears. She covered her face, sobbing loudly. A manipulation tactic I had seen 1,000 times throughout my childhood. "How can you be so ungrateful?" my mother wailed. "We provided you with everything. We raised you. We gave you a beautiful life in a beautiful neighborhood, and this is how you repay us in our absolute darkest hour." I let out a dry, humorless laugh that echoed in the dining room. "You gave me everything. Mom, let us be very clear about our family history right now. When Brandon went to college, you and Dad paid his full out-of-state tuition, covered his luxury apartment rent, and bought him a brand new car. When I got accepted into my university, you told me money was tight and handed me a stack of student loan applications. I worked 2 jobs, waiting tables and tutoring just to afford my textbooks while Brandon was taking expensive spring break trips to Cabo with his fraternity. I built my career and my bank account entirely on my own. You did not give me everything. I survived and thrived despite you." My father slammed his hand on the table again, his face turning an angry, volatile shade of purple. "Do not ever speak to your mother that way," Thomas shouted, standing up from his chair. "This is not up for debate, Danielle. We are family, and family protects each other at all costs. You have the money, and you are going to write that check. You have until Monday to pay the $460,000 to the firm. If you do not pay it, you are no longer our child. You will be dead to us." The dining room fell completely silent. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. They expected me to break down crying. They expected me to beg for their love and approval, just like I did when I was a little girl, desperately trying to earn their affection. Instead, I felt a massive, suffocating weight lift off my shoulders. I looked at my father, then at my crying mother, the cowardly brother, and his smirking wife. "Then I am not," I replied calmly. I stood up, pushed my heavy wooden chair in, and grabbed my winter coat from the entryway. I did not yell. I did not throw anything or cause a scene. I simply turned my back on them and walked out the front door, leaving my Thanksgiving dinner completely untouched on the table. The cold November air hit my face as I walked down the long driveway to my car, but I felt completely warm and grounded inside. I got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and locked the doors. I did not shed a single tear on the drive home. Instead, my brain shifted entirely into corporate audit mode. I knew exactly how my parents operated. They were desperate, and desperate people do incredibly dangerous things. They knew my social security number, my banking institutions, and my personal details from when I was a teenager living under their roof. I pulled over into a quiet parking lot, took out my phone, and immediately called my private banker's emergency weekend line. Within 15 minutes, sitting in the dark, I executed a flawless financial lockdown. I ordered a total and complete freeze on all my credit profiles, across every major credit bureau. I instructed my banker to move all of my liquid asset stocks and high-yield savings into a blind limited liability company trust that I had set up months prior for my real estate investments. Finally, I logged into my healthcare and legal portals and officially revoked my mother and her status as my emergency medical and financial proxy. I essentially erased my financial footprint from their reach. As I pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward my own home, my phone buzzed with an automated alert. Someone had just tried to open a $100,000 line of credit in my name, and it was immediately blocked. They thought they could bully me into submission, but they had no idea they had just declared war on a woman who dismantles fraudulent financial empires for a living. The morning after that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, I woke up in my own bed feeling a strange sense of quiet. I made myself a cup of black coffee and stood by the kitchen window watching the early sunlight hit the frost on my driveway. After walking out on my family, I thought I would be consumed by guilt. That is the reaction they had conditioned me to have since childhood. But standing there in my peaceful home, I felt absolutely nothing but relief. I sat down at my kitchen island and finally picked up my phone, which I had left on silent since the night before. The screen immediately lit up with an overwhelming flood of notifications. There were over 40 unread text messages, 15 missed calls, and a massive string of social media alerts. The digital social warfare had officially begun, and my sister-in-law Jasmine was leading the charge. I opened my social media apps and immediately saw what was causing the storm. Jasmine had leveraged her entire lifestyle influencer platform to launch a highly coordinated smear campaign. She had posted a long, tearful video to her feed. Jasmine usually posted luxury shopping hauls, expensive vacation recaps, and glamorous aesthetic content for her 200,000 followers. But today the lighting was dim and moody. The thumbnail showed her sitting on the floor of her pristine living room, wearing a plain, oversized gray sweater instead of her usual designer clothes. She wore no makeup, and her eyes were deliberately red and puffy, painting the perfect picture of a devastated victim. The caption beneath the video simply read, "What do you do when your own flesh and blood abandons you in your darkest hour?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, pressed play, and watched the performance unfold. In the video, Jasmine spoke directly to the camera with a trembling voice. She talked about how incredibly difficult the past few months had been for her and Brandon. She vaguely mentioned that Brandon had faced an unexpected and devastating setback with his technology business, carefully leaving out the fact that he owed a private equity firm $460,000 due to sheer incompetence. Then the real manipulation began. Jasmine looked down, wiping a single perfectly timed tear from her cheek. She told her audience that family is supposed to be your safety net, but that she and Brandon had just learned a cruel lesson about greed and selfishness. "We reached out for help," she told the camera, her voice breaking on command. "We asked a certain family member, someone who has more than enough wealth to help us survive this crisis, to just show a little compassion. But instead of helping us, they turned their back. They looked us in the eye and chose money over our survival." It is just so toxic and heartbreaking to realize that someone you love could be so incredibly cold and greedy. She never mentioned my name directly. She did not have to. The implication was entirely clear, and her loyal followers were eating it up. The comment section was a flood of support for Jasmine and absolute vitriol for this anonymous, wicked family member. People were telling Jasmine to stay strong, calling me a monster, and sharing their own stories of cutting off toxic relatives. Jasmine was weaponizing public sympathy to build an army against me, using her platform to paint me as the villain, while entirely erasing the reality of their massive financial fraud. The video did exactly what Jasmine intended it to do. It acted as a dog whistle for my entire extended family. My phone was blowing up because my aunts, uncles, and cousins had all seen the post, connected the dots, and decided to unleash their misplaced outrage onto me. These were relatives who only reached out to me once a year for holiday greetings, but suddenly they were all deeply invested in my financial choices. My Aunt Brenda texted me a long paragraph saying she was absolutely disgusted by my behavior and that my grandfather would be ashamed of how I was treating my own brother. My cousin David sent me a voice note calling me a selfish corporate snob who forgot where she came from. The hypocrisy was astounding. Not a single one of these outraged relatives was offering to remortgage their own homes or empty their own bank accounts to pay off the $460,000 debt. They were just furious that I was refusing to play my assigned role as the family scapegoat and financial safety net. They wanted me to set myself on fire to keep Brandon warm just so the family boat would not rock. 10 years ago, receiving these messages would have sent me into a full panic attack. I would have spent hours drafting apologies and trying to explain my side of the story. But now, as a 33-year-old woman who understood the mechanics of toxic family systems, I felt nothing but a cold, analytical clarity. I did not reply to a single message. Engaging in a text war would only give them the drama and the reaction they were desperately seeking. Instead, I decided to take concrete preemptive legal measures. I knew that my family would not stop at social media harassment. They were desperate, and Jasmine had just proven that they were willing to publicly destroy my reputation to get what they wanted. I had already locked down my finances the night before, but there was one critical vulnerability I had forgotten. I immediately opened my laptop and pulled up the contact information for my estate planning lawyer. Several years ago, before I fully understood how toxic my parents truly were, I had set up my medical directives and power of attorney. At the time, it seemed completely standard to list my mother Carol as my primary medical and financial proxy in the event of an emergency. Sitting in my kitchen, a cold chill ran down my spine as I realized the immense danger of that legal document. If I were to be in a car accident or become incapacitated tomorrow, my mother would have full legal authority to make decisions about my health care and, more importantly, complete access to manage my remaining accessible financial accounts. Given that my parents had already illegally leveraged their own home to fund my brother, I had zero doubt my mother would drain my accounts the moment she legally could. I drafted an urgent email to my lawyer instructing him to formally revoke Carol as my proxy effective immediately. I asked him to draft the new paperwork naming my trusted best friend as my agent instead. Taking this step was not just about protecting my assets. It was about severing the final legal tie that bound me to their authority. It was a crucial, necessary move setting the permanent stage for the ironclad boundaries I was building to protect myself. They thought they could shame me into submission through public pressure and family guilt. They were completely wrong. I was not going to be their victim anymore. I was taking power back. By Tuesday morning, the digital harassment had reached a fever pitch, but I remained completely silent. My refusal to engage with the social media circus infuriated Jasmine more than any angry text message ever could. Narcissists absolutely hate being ignored because silence deprives them of the emotional reaction they desperately crave. I woke up, got dressed in my tailored navy blue suit, and drove to my corporate office downtown just like any other normal weekday. My firm occupied the top 3 floors of a massive glass and steel skyscraper. It was a sanctuary of logic, numbers, and strict professional boundaries. Walking into the polished marble lobby of my building, I felt a profound sense of safety. I scanned my security badge, grabbed a latte from the downstairs cafe, and headed up to my department. The morning was incredibly productive. I was deeply focused on auditing a complex corporate merger, analyzing spreadsheets, and identifying financial discrepancies. For a few glorious hours, my toxic family did not exist. I was just Danielle, the highly capable financial auditor, doing what I do best. But that peace was abruptly shattered just before my lunch break, when the elevator doors chimed open on my floor. Jasmine had somehow managed to bypass the main security desk downstairs. She was wearing massive designer sunglasses, a luxury trench coat, and carrying a highly recognizable luxury handbag. She marched right past the confused receptionist at the front desk of our accounting firm, ignoring the polite requests to sign in. Jasmine was practically vibrating with rage. She had come here with one specific goal in mind, which was to publicly humiliate me in front of my peers and force my hand. She spotted me standing near the large glass conference room, talking quietly with 2 of my senior managing partners. "Danielle," she screamed at the top of her lungs. Her shrill voice echoed instantly through the open concept office floor, completely shattering the quiet professional atmosphere. Dozens of my colleagues stopped typing and turned their heads in absolute shock. Jasmine stormed across the carpeted floor, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "How dare you ignore my daily calls?" she yelled, her face twisting into an ugly sneer. "Your own brother is drowning in debt, and you are sitting here in your fancy office drinking hot coffee while our entire family falls completely apart because of your terrible selfishness." My senior partners looked completely bewildered, but I did not even flinch. I did not drop my coffee. I did not break eye contact. I simply stood there radiating an aura of absolute calm. My stoic demeanor only made Jasmine scream louder. She wanted me to cry or yell back or beg her to stop so she could play the victim. "Sign over your retirement account right now," Jasmine demanded, slapping her hand hard against the glass wall of the conference room. You have a massive 401k savings plan, and you are going to empty it. You are going to use your retirement money to save Brandon right now, or I swear I will stand here all day and tell every single person in this building exactly what kind of monster you really are. It was the ultimate emotional manipulation tactic. She genuinely believed that the threat of workplace embarrassment would terrify me into surrendering my life savings. She thought I would be so incredibly ashamed of having a public family meltdown that I would drag her into a private room and agree to whatever insane financial demands she was making just to make her leave. Jasmine was entirely wrong. I am an auditor. My entire career is built on maintaining composure during high-stakes financial investigations. I regularly sit across the table from millionaire executives who try to intimidate me when I uncover their corporate fraud. A screaming lifestyle influencer in a trench coat was not going to break my composure. I turned to my senior partners, gave them a brief apologetic nod, and calmly pulled my cell phone from my blazer pocket. I did not say a single word to Jasmine. I simply dialed the direct emergency extension for our building security management team. Yes, we have an unauthorized and hostile individual trespassing on the 20th floor, I said into the phone, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any emotion. Please send a security detail immediately. Jasmine let out a loud, dramatic gasp, staring at me in total disbelief. You are calling security on your own sister-in-law? She shrieked, taking a step closer to me. I lowered the phone and looked directly into her eyes. My voice was chillingly quiet, but it carried across the room. You are trespassing in a private corporate facility, Jasmine. Leave the premises right now. She opened her mouth to scream another insult, but the elevator doors suddenly dinged. 3 very large uniformed security guards stepped out onto our floor. They moved quickly and efficiently, flanking Jasmine on both sides. Madam, you need to come with us right now, one of the guards commanded, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. Jasmine tried to shake him off, screaming that she was family and had a right to be there, but the guards were not interested in her excuses. They physically guided her back toward the freight elevator while she continued to kick and loudly curse. The entire office floor watched in stunned silence as the doors closed, cutting off the hysterical screaming. The moment she was gone, the heavy silence returned to the floor. I took a deep breath, smoothed the lapels of my blazer, and turned back to my colleagues. I apologize for that unexpected disruption, I said, projecting a completely professional tone. My family is currently dealing with some significant financial distress. Let us return to the merger analysis. My partners nodded respectfully, clearly impressed by my unshakable composure. But I knew the ugly situation was far from over, and I needed evidence. I did not retreat to the restroom to cry. I did not hide under my desk in shame. Instead, I immediately walked down the hall to the Human Resources Department. I sat down directly with the HR director and gave a brief factual account of the incident. I explained that an unstable, estranged family member had trespassed and attempted to extort money from me in the workplace. I formally requested that Jasmine be permanently banned from the premises and that my name be flagged at the front security desk to prevent any future unauthorized family visitors from accessing my floor. After finishing the paperwork with Human Resources, I took the elevator down to the basement level to visit the building management office. I introduced myself to the head of security and explained the gravity of the situation. I specifically needed the closed-circuit television footage of the incident. In the corporate world, documentation is absolutely everything. If Jasmine decided to escalate her lies and claim that I had physically attacked her or threatened her, I needed indisputable visual proof of exactly what had transpired. The security director understood completely and agreed to pull the digital files from my personal records. The moment I returned to my desk, my heart was still beating a little faster than usual, but my mind was completely clear. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and took a deep breath, letting the quiet hum of the corporate office ground me. Jasmine and her hysterical screaming were gone, and I was back in my element. I closed the file on the corporate merger I had been reviewing earlier and opened a brand new secure window on my dual monitors. My auditor instincts had fully taken over, pushing aside any lingering feelings of family obligation or shock. There was a massive glaring question that had been bothering me ever since my father slammed that foreclosure notice onto my dinner plate at Thanksgiving. $460,000 is an incredible amount of money to simply vanish into thin air. Even in the highly volatile world of cryptocurrency startups, a sudden total loss of almost $500,000 leaves a very specific kind of digital footprint. Brandon was arrogant and lazy, but he was not a sophisticated financial mastermind. He was a guy who watched too many online videos and thought he could get rich quick. I knew in my gut that the math simply did not add up. I pulled up the state business registry database and typed in the name of my brother and his limited liability company. Because I am a certified financial auditor, I have professional access to comprehensive public record databases and forensic tracing software that the average person does not even know exists. I started pulling every piece of publicly available financial data tied to his business name. I downloaded the articles of incorporation, the tax liens, and the public bankruptcy filings. As I started to comb through the initial documents, a very clear and very ugly picture began to emerge. Brandon had not just experienced a stroke of bad luck in a declining digital market. He had been running his business like a personal piggy bank from the very beginning. I spent the next 2 hours completely immersed in the numbers, tracing the flow of capital from his initial investors straight through to his final days of operation. It is amazing what people think they can hide behind a computer screen. I found a series of complex wire transfers that had been executed just weeks before he officially filed for business bankruptcy. When a legitimate business is failing, the remaining capital is usually drained by desperate attempts to pay off angry vendors or keep the lights on. But that is not what Brandon did. Instead, the ledgers showed a highly systematic bleeding of the company accounts. Large chunks of cash were being moved out in increments of $9,000, a common tactic used to avoid federal banking transaction flags. I followed the digital trail of those $9,000 increments. They were bouncing from his primary business account into a secondary shell company that he had registered in Delaware. From there, the money was being funneled directly to an offshore banking institution located in the Caribbean. My eyes scanned the screen as I ran a reverse search on the receiving account details. My heart started pounding as the search results finally populated on my monitor. The offshore account was not registered to Brandon. It was registered under a maiden name. It was Jasmine's maiden name. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen, feeling a cold wave of absolute disgust wash over me. I quickly calculated the total sum of the wire transfers that had been sent to Jasmine's secret offshore account in the weeks leading up to the collapse. It was exactly $150,000. Brandon did not lose all of that money in bad cryptocurrency trades. He intentionally siphoned it out of his failing business and hid it in his wife and her secret overseas bank account before the creditors could seize it. And the worst part was the timeline. I cross-referenced the dates of those offshore wire transfers with the date my parents took out the secret second mortgage on their family home. The dates matched perfectly. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My parents did not just bail out a struggling young entrepreneur who made an honest mistake. They had literally signed away the roof over their own heads to fund Jasmine's luxury influencer lifestyle. That $460,000 debt was not just a business failure. It was the result of severe financial mismanagement and deliberate embezzlement. The Cartier bracelets, the designer trench coats, the constant luxury vacations that Jasmine flaunted on her social media channels to her 200,000 followers. All of it was paid for by the money my parents had illegally borrowed against their house. My mother and father were going to lose their home, become completely homeless, and destroy their golden years just so Jasmine could maintain the illusion of being a wealthy socialite online. And now they were demanding that I empty my own retirement accounts and drain my life savings to cover up this massive fraud. They wanted me to pay off the private equity firm so Brandon and Jasmine could quietly keep the $150,000 they had stolen and hidden away. The sheer audacity of their entitlement was breathtaking. Jasmine had just stood in my corporate lobby screaming at me, calling me greedy and toxic, while she was secretly sitting on a massive pile of stolen cash. She had the nerve to demand my hard-earned 401k money while her own offshore account was fully funded by my parents' ruined mortgage. I felt a sharp, intense focus take over my entire body. I was no longer just a sister trying to set a boundary with a toxic family. I was an auditor who had just uncovered a massive financial crime, and I was holding all the cards. I did not feel sad anymore. I did not feel guilty. I felt incredibly powerful. I started right-clicking and downloading every single ledger, every wire transfer receipt, and every corporate filing. I saved them to a highly secure encrypted folder on my local drive and then immediately created 3 separate backup copies on secure external servers. I was carefully preparing my arsenal. I printed copies of the most damning documents, including the offshore registration, showing Jasmine's maiden name and the exact timestamps. I organized the paperwork into a thick manila folder labeling it with his company name. This was the proof I needed. If they wanted to play a public game of social media victimhood, I was going to play a private game of absolute financial destruction. They thought they were dealing with the quiet, obedient daughter who would eventually cave under the pressure of family guilt. They had no idea they had handed a loaded gun to a corporate financial auditor. I placed the folder into my leather briefcase and locked it. I was completely ready for whatever desperate move they decided to make next, because I knew exactly where all the money went. Wednesday morning arrived with a heavy downpour of rain that seemed to match the dark reality of my family situation. I was working from home that day reviewing the digital files I had secured. I felt confident. I had locked down my accounts, protected my medical proxy, and gathered irrefutable evidence of my brother embezzling funds into his wife and her offshore account. I thought I was fully insulated from the fallout, but I was completely wrong. Around 11 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I walked over and saw a postal worker standing on my porch holding a clipboard. He handed me a thick, certified letter requiring my direct signature. I signed the pad and closed the door. The return address on the envelope made my stomach drop instantly. It was from the same private equity firm currently foreclosing on my parents' house and hunting down my brother for his massive debt. I stared at the envelope. I had absolutely no financial relationship with this firm. I had never co-signed any agreements for Brandon. I tore open the heavy paper and pulled out the legal documents. The bold letters at the top of the page made the breath catch in my throat. It was a formal notice of intent to place a lien on my personal property. The document stated I was now legally responsible for a delinquent line of credit totaling $100,000. The firm was moving to attach a lien to my cars, my bank accounts, and the very house I was standing in. I stood there completely paralyzed by confusion. I had meticulously frozen my credit just a few days ago. I had moved my major assets into a blind trust. How could a private equity firm suddenly stake a claim on my life? My initial shock quickly morphed into a cold, calculated panic. I immediately picked up my phone and called my personal attorney. I explained the certified letter reading the account numbers and the legal threats out loud to him. My lawyer was just as confused as I was. He assured me my recent asset protection measures were solid, but noted this suggested a pre-existing financial obligation. He told me to stay calm while he reached out directly to the legal department of the private equity firm to demand the original loan origination documents. The next 24 hours were absolute torture. I paced around my house, unable to eat or sleep, running every possible financial scenario through my head. Had I signed something years ago when Brandon started his company? On Thursday afternoon, my phone finally rang. It was my lawyer, and his tone was incredibly serious. He told me to come down to his office immediately. When I arrived, he escorted me into his private conference room and closed the heavy wooden door behind us. He did not offer me a drink or make small talk. He simply opened a file folder and slid a stack of high-quality photocopies across the large mahogany table. These are the original guarantor documents from the private equity firm, he explained quietly. They were filed 8 months ago, right around the time your brother started experiencing massive cash flow issues. I looked down at the paperwork. It was an application for a $100,000 emergency business line of credit. The primary borrower listed was my brother. But right there on the bottom line, designated as the primary financial guarantor, was my name. I stared at the signature line. Someone had signed my full legal name in blue ink. The handwriting was a very close match to my own, but as an auditor trained to spot discrepancies, I immediately saw the subtle differences. The loop on the capital D was slightly too sharp, the slant of the letters was just a fraction of a degree off. It was a forgery, and I knew exactly who had done it. I closed my eyes as a wave of profound physical nausea washed over me. I remembered how my father Thomas used to help me fill out my college loan applications. I remembered how he kept meticulously organized files of all our family documents in his home office, including copies of my old tax returns and my social security card. My own father had used my personal identification details to secure a massive loan for his golden child. The horrific reality of the situation crashed down on me. My parents had not just made a terrible financial mistake by taking out a second mortgage on their home. They had actively, maliciously, and deliberately committed a severe federal crime against their own daughter. They had committed identity theft and bank fraud to float my brother and his failing business so his wife could keep buying designer handbags. This was no longer just a toxic family dispute over holiday dinners and favoritism. This was a massive felony that crossed every possible legal and moral boundary. My father had literally mortgaged my future and my good name without a second thought, completely willing to let me take the fall if things went wrong, and things had gone terribly wrong. My lawyer sat across from me, watching my face carefully. He leaned forward and folded his hands on the table. "Danielle, we have a very serious situation here," he said gently. "This is undeniable fraud, but you need to understand the implications of how we choose to proceed. You are a highly successful woman. You have the liquid assets. You could quietly pay off the $100,000 right now. If you pay the debt, the private equity firm will release the lien, and this entire situation goes away. Your parents will lose their house, but they will avoid prison. If we do not pay this and we challenge the signature we have to claim identity theft, we will have to involve the authorities. Your father could face serious federal prison time for wire fraud and forgery. He was giving me the out. He was offering me the exact solution my family expected me to take. They forged my name because they knew I could afford the hit. They banked on the fact that I would be too embarrassed or too loyal to send my own father to jail. They thought I would simply absorb the $100,000 loss as the price of keeping the family intact. I sat in the quiet conference room listening to the hum of the air conditioning. I thought about Jasmine screaming at me in my corporate lobby. I thought about my mother crying fake tears at Thanksgiving. I thought about my father telling me I was no longer his child if I did not pay a debt I had nothing to do with. I looked my lawyer directly in the eyes. I felt absolutely no sorrow and no hesitation. "I do not pay ransoms," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I build prisons. I am not giving them a single dime of my money to cover up their crimes. I want you to prepare whatever documentation we need. I am choosing the nuclear option. We are going to the police." I left my lawyer's office with the heavy manila folder tucked firmly under my arm. The rain was still coming down in sheets, turning the city streets into a gray blur. I got into my car and sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, just listening to the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers. My cell phone was sitting in the cup holder. I knew that a normal daughter might pick it up and call her father. She might desperately ask him why he would do something so incredibly cruel to his own flesh and blood. A normal daughter might scream and cry and demand to know how he could possibly forge her signature on a $100,000 loan. She might give him a chance to explain or beg for mercy. But they had already shown me exactly who they were. Thomas had looked me in the eye at Thanksgiving and told me I was no longer his child if I did not fix his mess. He had already disowned me. I was just making it official. I put the car in drive and pulled out into the heavy traffic, heading directly toward the downtown police precinct. I was not going to warn them. I was not going to negotiate with financial terrorists simply because we shared the same bloodline. Walking into the local police precinct was like stepping into another reality. The air smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. Fluorescent lights buzzed loudly overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the waiting room. I approached the thick, bulletproof glass at the front desk and spoke to the duty officer. I told him I needed to report a massive case of identity theft and corporate wire fraud. Because of the sheer dollar amount involved, I was quickly escorted past the main lobby and down a narrow hallway to the Financial Crimes Division. I was seated in a small, windowless interview room, holding my briefcase on my lap. The absolute finality of what I was about to do hung heavily in the cold air. For 33 years, I had been conditioned to protect my family reputation at all costs. Growing up, the golden rule in our house was that whatever happened behind closed doors stayed behind closed doors. You never embarrass the family. By sitting in this room, I was taking a sledgehammer to that rule. I was preparing to hand my father and my brother over to the federal justice system. A tall detective with graying hair and tired eyes walked into the room carrying a yellow legal pad. He introduced himself as Detective Miller and sat down across the metal table from me. He asked me to walk him through the situation from the beginning. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the perfectly organized files I had prepared. I am an auditor by trade. I began keeping my voice perfectly level and objective. I am here to report a $100,000 forged line of credit taken out in my name and the subsequent embezzlement of those funds. I slid the copies of the original loan guarantor documents across the table. I pointed out my forged signature, clearly explaining how my father Thomas had used my social security number and personal details to secure the loan for my brother Brandon. Then I pulled out the secondary folder containing the financial deep dive I had conducted. I showed the detective the ledger transfers, proving that Brandon had deliberately wired the loan money into an offshore account registered to his wife Jasmine right before declaring bankruptcy. Detective Miller slowly reviewed the documents, his expression shifting from routine boredom to sharp professional interest. He looked up at me, and I could see the quiet realization in his eyes. He knew exactly what this meant. "You understand that these are severe felony charges," he said, leaning back in his chair. "If I take this report and forward these documents to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service, we cannot simply undo it later if you have a change of heart. Your father is looking at aggravated identity theft and bank fraud. Your brother is looking at wire fraud and deliberate asset concealment. They are facing significant federal prison time. Are you absolutely certain you want to file criminal charges against your own father and brother?" I did not blink. I did not look away. "I am completely certain," I replied. "They did not have a change of heart when they stole my identity, and they did not have a change of heart when they tried to extort my life savings to cover it up. They are criminals who happen to be related to me." The detective nodded slowly, respecting my unwavering resolve. He pushed a formal complaint form across the metal table and handed me a black pen. I stared at the signature line. This was the exact same action my father had taken 8 months ago when he forged my name to steal my future. But this time, the signature was going to be real, and it was going to be my absolute liberation. I picked up the pen and signed my name with firm, deliberate strokes. In that single moment, the heavy, toxic chain that had bound me to my family for my entire life finally snapped. I felt an incredible surge of power and profound peace. I was permanently severing the tie. I knew that this criminal investigation would completely destroy my father and his carefully curated country club reputation. It would strip away all his arrogant pride forever. I knew it would likely end with Brandon losing his freedom and Jasmine losing her stolen luxury lifestyle. But I felt absolutely no guilt. Absolutely none at all. I stood up, shook the detective by the hand, and walked out of the precinct into the cold rain. I had established the ultimate boundary, and there was no going back. After leaving the police precinct, I drove back to my house, feeling a strange mix of adrenaline and profound calm. The initial shock of my father forging my signature had entirely worn off, replaced by the cold precision of my daily profession. As an auditor, when I uncover a thread of fraud, I follow it until the sweater unravels. I knew federal investigators would take time to build their case against Thomas and Brandon. The justice system moves slowly, but private equity firms absolutely do not. The firm holding the massive debt was a ruthless machine. They only cared about liquidating assets to recover capital. I opened my laptop to monitor public legal filings associated with my parents' property. Because my father illegally leveraged their residence to fund my brother, the house was the first target. I logged into the county clerk database and searched the property records for my childhood home. What I found made me sit back. My parents had completely defaulted on the second mortgage. They had not made a single payment in over 4 months. In their attempt to fund Jasmine's lifestyle, they ignored compounding interest and legal warnings. The private equity firm had officially seized the property. They had fast-tracked the foreclosure process to immediately recoup their losses. I clicked on the Public Notices tab and my eyes widened at the timeline. The family home was scheduled to be sold at a public bank auction in exactly 48 hours. My parents were currently sitting in their living room, completely oblivious that their roof was about to be auctioned off. They probably assumed the process would take months, giving them time to guilt-trip me. They were incredibly wrong. I stared at the auction listing on my screen and a bold, unprecedented idea began to form in my mind. When I walked out of that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, I had immediately called my private banker and moved all my liquid assets into a blind, limited liability company trust. I did that initially to protect my money from my mother and her potential financial proxy access. But now that blind trust presented a perfect opportunity. The LLC was a fully funded legal entity completely detached from my personal name. It was essentially an anonymous corporate buyer with massive cash reserves. I picked up my phone and called my financial manager. I instructed him to register my LLC for the upcoming county property auction. I told him I wanted to bid on a specific foreclosed property, and I wanted to do it entirely in cash. He was slightly surprised by the sudden real estate venture, but as a professional, he executed the request immediately. Within 2 hours, my anonymous corporate entity was fully verified and approved to participate in the public bidding process. Buying my parents' house was not about nostalgia or saving my childhood memories. My childhood in that house was a miserable experience of constant comparison and emotional neglect. Buying the house was about absolute control and poetic justice. My parents had forged my name to steal my future. They had demanded I empty my retirement accounts to save them. They had threatened to disown me if I did not submit to their toxic authority. By purchasing the property through my anonymous trust, I was taking away the very foundation of their arrogance. I was going to turn the tables in a way they could never possibly anticipate. I spent the next day preparing the funds, ensuring that the cash was perfectly positioned in the escrow accounts. I did not tell a single soul about my plan. I did not text my friends or consult my lawyer. I kept my silence, letting my family continue their ridiculous public smear campaigns online, while I silently orchestrated their absolute financial checkmate. Friday morning arrived and the digital county auction officially opened. I sat at my desk with a cup of hot tea watching the screen closely. Real estate auctions are usually dominated by corporate flippers and aggressive investors looking for a cheap deal. They prey on foreclosed family homes, hoping to buy them for pennies on the dollar, gut them, and sell them for a massive profit. As soon as the bidding opened for my parents' property, a flurry of lowball offers populated the screen. 3 different investment groups were fighting over the house, bumping the price up in tiny incremental steps. They were trying to get a bargain because they knew the house carried a heavy lien history. I watched them play their petty games for about 20 minutes. I sipped my tea and waited patiently for the bidding momentum to slow down. Once the corporate flippers reached what they believed was the maximum profitable threshold, the bids stalled. The system showed the countdown timer ticking down the final seconds. I did not wait for the timer to expire. I moved my mouse and entered my final bid through the anonymous LLC portal. I did not just incrementally raise the price to beat the flippers. I dropped a massive, overwhelming all-cash bid that completely blew every other offer out of the water. It was a sum that instantly finalized the auction and secured the property without any room for counteroffers. The screen flashed green, confirming the transaction was successful. The corporate flippers were instantly locked out. The electronic gavel fell. The auction was officially closed. I sat in my quiet home office staring at the digital confirmation receipt glowing on my monitor. The money was instantly wired from my trust account to the county clerk and the private equity firm. The massive debt on the house was completely wiped clean by my anonymous corporation. I printed the confirmation page and held the warm paper in my hands. I walked over to my window and looked out at the street, feeling a profound sense of shifting power. The legal reality of what had just happened was staggering. Without a single word spoken, without a single argument or confrontation, I had just become the sole legal owner of the house my parents were currently sleeping in. They had absolutely no idea. As far as Thomas and Carol knew, a faceless corporate entity had purchased their foreclosed home, and they were probably dreading the arrival of some aggressive property manager. They had no idea that the anonymous landlord who now held their fate in her hands was the very same daughter they had publicly disowned and legally betrayed just a few days prior. I had not just established a boundary, I had bought the entire playing field. I fully owned the walls, the roof, the manicured lawn, and the long driveway where they had parked the car they bought for my golden child brother. The deed was being legally transferred into the name of my company right at that very moment. I folded the auction receipt, placed it perfectly inside the manila folder with the rest of my evidence, and smiled for the first time all week. The game was no longer simply about them trying to force me to pay. The game was now entirely mine, and I was finally going to finish it today. Saturday morning brought a sudden and entirely unexpected phone call from my mother, Carol. "Danielle, please do not hang up," my mother said, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Please just meet me for a quick coffee this afternoon. I want to apologize and try to make things right between us." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, knowing instantly that this was a trap. My mother never apologized unless she wanted something in return. She was completely unaware that I had already filed federal felony charges against my father and brother. She was also blissfully unaware that my anonymous corporation had just purchased the foreclosed roof right over her head less than 24 hours ago. She thought I was still just the angry daughter who needed to be coaxed back into the family fold. I agreed to meet her at a small upscale cafe downtown, but I was not going to walk into an ambush unprepared. I live in a one-party consent state, which means that as long as I am a participant in the conversation, I am legally allowed to record it without informing the other person. I took a small high-definition digital voice recorder from my home office, turned it on, and slipped it deep into the breast pocket of my tailored blazer. I had the paper trail from the bank and I had the police report, but a recorded verbal confession from my mother would be the absolute final nail in their legal coffin. When I walked into the busy downtown cafe, it was a perfectly normal Saturday afternoon for everyone else. But for me, it was a highly calculated sting operation. I spotted my mother sitting in a quiet corner booth. She had clearly dressed for the part of the grieving, desperate mother. She looked up and gave me a weak, tremulous smile as I slid into the booth across from her. "Thank you so much for coming, Danielle," she whispered, reaching across the table to try and hold my hand. I smoothly pulled my hands back and wrapped them around my coffee mug, denying her the physical connection she was trying to use to soften my resolve. "I am here to listen, Mom," I said plainly. "Tell me what you need to say." Carol took a deep, shuddering breath and immediately launched into her rehearsed script. She told me how much she loved me and how her heart was just completely broken over the tension in the family. She talked about how my father was losing sleep, and how Brandon was spiraling into a deep depression over his failed business. She spent a solid 10 minutes trying to systematically break down my emotional defenses, painting a tragic picture of a family on the brink of total collapse. I sat there nodding slowly, maintaining direct eye contact while the recorder in my pocket captured every single manipulative word. I let her spin her web of lies, knowing exactly where this conversation was ultimately heading. Finally, after the tears and the long, tragic stories, She slowly pivoted to the real reason she had asked me to meet her. Danielle, you have to understand how desperate we are, she said, leaning closer to me and lowering her voice. The private equity firm is threatening to take absolutely everything. I kept my face entirely blank. I am very aware of the private equity firm, Mom, I replied. I received a certified letter from them stating that I owe them $100,000 on a line of credit that I never opened. Carol flinched slightly, but quickly recovered her composure. That is exactly why I wanted to talk to you, she said, her eyes pleading with me. We need you to just step up and claim the debt, Danielle. $100,000 is nothing to you. It will not change your lifestyle at all, but it will literally save our family from complete ruin. If you just call the bank and agree to assume the payments, we can put all of this ugliness behind us. We can be a happy family again. I felt a cold wave of absolute disgust wash over me. She was sitting right in front of me, casually asking me to accept legal responsibility for a six-figure debt that my father had fraudulently created. She was asking me to become an accomplice to their crime just to keep up appearances. I took a slow sip of my coffee, deliberately letting the silence stretch out between us. This was the critical moment. I needed to guide her right into the trap without making her suspicious. I just do not understand how this even happened, Mom, I said, letting my voice sound slightly confused and vulnerable. I never spoke to that private equity firm. I never signed any loan documents for Brandon. How can the bank claim that I am the primary guarantor? Carol sighed and shook her head as if I were a child failing to grasp a simple concept. She fell right into the trap. We had to do it, Danielle, she said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. Brandon needed the capital immediately to save his company from going under. We did not have any other choice. I leaned forward slightly, ensuring the microphone in my pocket would catch every single syllable. What do you mean you had to do it? I asked, keeping my tone perfectly innocent. Who signed my name on those guarantor documents? Carol let out an exasperated breath, looking at me with pure, unadulterated entitlement. Your father only signed your name because we knew you had the credit score to handle it, she stated explicitly. It was an emergency, and you were not answering your phone that week. We knew you would eventually agree to help your brother, so Thomas just filled out the application and signed for you to expedite the funds. It is not that big of a deal. Danielle, families help each other out in emergencies all the time. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air between us. She had just casually confessed to federal identity theft and bank fraud in the middle of a crowded coffee shop. I felt a massive surge of adrenaline, but I kept my facial expression completely neutral. I had it. I had the ultimate, undeniable proof recording securely on the device in my blazer pocket. I nodded slowly, pretending to process her explanation. So Dad signed the papers. I murmured loud enough for the microphone to pick up clearly. Yes, he did. And he did it for the family. Carol confirmed, sealing her own fate. I finished my coffee and stood up from the booth, giving her a tight smile. I need to think about all of this, Mom, I said softly. I will be in touch. I walked out of the cafe, leaving her convinced that she had successfully manipulated me into paying their fraudulent debt. She had absolutely no idea that she had just handed me the very weapon I needed to destroy them completely. This was the final piece of my perfect revenge plan. I stood up from the booth, preparing to walk away, with the ultimate confessions safely recorded in my pocket. But my mother was not finished. The moment I said I needed to think about things, the fragile, weeping mother persona completely vanished. It was like watching a switch flip behind her eyes. Her shoulders straightened, her posture stiffened, and a cold, calculating smirk spread across her face. She reached out and grabbed my wrist with a surprisingly strong grip, stopping me from leaving the table. Sit back down, Danielle, she commanded, her voice completely devoid of the artificial warmth she had been projecting for the last 20 minutes. You are not going to just think about it. You're going to fix this today because we have already taken steps to ensure you do not have a choice. I looked down at her hand gripping my wrist and then back up to her face. I slowly pulled my arm away and remained standing. What exactly are you talking about, Mom? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady while my mind raced. Carol leaned back against the plush leather of the booth, crossing her arms over her chest with a look of absolute triumph. She honestly believed she had backed me into an inescapable corner. "We knew you would be stubborn," she said casually, as if we were discussing the weather. "You always were such a difficult child. So your father and I decided we needed some collateral to make sure you understood how serious this situation really is. Do you remember 2 years ago when you went on that business trip to London and asked us to watch your house?" I felt a slight prickle of irritation, but I did not let it show. "I remember," I said flatly. "Well," Carol continued, her smirk widening, "you gave us a spare set of keys to check the mail and water the plants. You asked for them back when you returned, but your father thought it would be a good idea to keep a copy just in case of an emergency. And this, Danielle, is an emergency." "Early this morning, while you were presumably sleeping, your brother and Jasmine took a little ride over to your neighborhood. They used that spare key to unlock your secondary car, the black luxury sports utility vehicle you keep parked on the side of your driveway. They started the engine and drove it right off your property." I stared at her, letting the sheer audacity of her words hang in the air between us. My own family had crept onto my property in the dead of night and stolen a $70,000 vehicle. "And where is my car right now?" I asked, my tone completely flat, masking the incredible surge of adrenaline pumping through my veins. Carol took a sip of her water, looking incredibly pleased with herself. "Right now, Jasmine is driving it around town running some errands. But tomorrow morning, Brandon is taking it to a specialized dealership he knows on the outskirts of the city. It is a place that does not ask too many questions, and they are willing to give us a very generous cash installment for a luxury vehicle like yours. Of course, it will not cover the full $100,000, but it will give us enough cash to keep the private equity firm happy for a few more months. Unless, of course, you call the bank today and agree to take over the debt. If you do that, we will happily return the car to your driveway tonight with a full tank of gas. It is entirely up to you, Danielle. Either you take the debt or you say goodbye to your expensive car forever." She sat there beaming, expecting me to panic. She expected me to sit back down, beg for my car, and surrender my financial independence to her manipulation. She thought I would be completely terrified of losing my property. Instead, I felt a massive, genuine smile spread across my face. It was the first real smile I had given her in years. I looked down at my mother and felt nothing but profound pity for how incredibly foolish she was. "You really should have just asked me for the money, Mom," I said softly, leaning slightly forward so she could hear the absolute certainty in my voice. "It would have saved you all a lot of prison time." Before she could even process what I had just said, I turned around and walked straight out of the coffee shop. I did not look back to see her reaction. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. The recording device hidden safely inside my blazer pocket had captured every single word of her brazen extortion attempt. She had just explicitly confessed to orchestrating the grand theft of a motor vehicle, and she had voluntarily named my brother and my sister-in-law as the active perpetrators. They thought they were playing a brilliant game of chess against a defenseless opponent, but they were essentially playing with matches in a room full of gasoline. I walked briskly down the busy city sidewalk until I reached the secure parking garage where my primary car was parked. I got into the driver's seat, locked the doors securely, and immediately pulled my cell phone from my leather purse. I did not call my corporate lawyer to ask for legal advice. I did not call the private equity firm to negotiate a settlement. I dialed 911. The emergency dispatcher answered almost immediately, asking for the nature of my emergency. "I am calling to report a stolen vehicle." I said, my voice perfectly calm and authoritative, reflecting years of corporate training. "I am the registered owner of a black luxury sports utility vehicle, and it was removed from my private driveway without my consent early this morning." The operator asked for the license plate number and the exact make and model, which I provided instantly from memory. Then she asked the critical question that I had been waiting for. "Do you have any idea who might have taken the vehicle, Mom?" I smiled, looking at myself in the rearview mirror as I delivered the final blow. Yes, I do, I replied clearly and confidently. I was just informed that my estranged brother, Brandon, and his wife, Jasmine, stole the vehicle using an illicitly duplicated key. They are currently driving it around the downtown metropolitan area, and they have explicitly threatened to sell it to an illegal chop shop by tomorrow morning if I do not pay them a ransom. I gave the dispatcher their full legal names, their physical descriptions, and the specific address of Jasmine's favorite exclusive country club, where I knew she spent all of her Saturday afternoons. The operator informed me that she was immediately dispatching officers and broadcasting the vehicle details to all active units in the surrounding area. I thanked her politely and ended the call. While I was calmly driving back to my own home, my sister-in-law Jasmine was experiencing the absolute peak of her delusional reality. She was cruising down the main interstate highway, heading toward the most exclusive country club in the city for a luxury weekend luncheon with her wealthy friends. She was driving my black sports utility vehicle, and she was feeling incredibly proud of herself. In her mind, she and my family had successfully outsmarted me. They had taken my property, and they fully believed I would just surrender and pay their massive debt to get it back. Jasmine was so arrogant and so completely disconnected from the real-world consequences of Grand Theft Auto that she decided to broadcast her triumph to the internet. She had mounted her phone to the dashboard of my car and was actively broadcasting a live stream to her 200,000 followers. I later watched the archived footage of this broadcast, and it was a masterpiece of poetic justice. In the video, Jasmine is wearing oversized designer sunglasses and sipping an expensive iced matcha latte. She is smiling radiantly at the camera, flipping her hair, and talking about her fabulous weekend plans. She casually pans the camera around the pristine leather interior of my car, bragging to her audience about her brand new luxury vehicle. She tells her followers that she and her husband Brandon just decided to upgrade their lifestyle because their business investments are doing so incredibly well. She is literally sitting inside a stolen car, funded by my parents' ruined mortgage, and she is using it to farm likes and validation from strangers on the internet. She talks about the importance of manifesting wealth and cutting out toxic people who do not support your success. It is a masterclass in narcissistic projection. She is completely oblivious to the fact that the license plate of the car she is flaunting has just been flagged as stolen in every active police cruiser database within a 50-mile radius. As Jasmine merged onto the highway exit ramp that leads directly to the country club, the situation abruptly changed. In the background of her live stream, you can see the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the rear window. At first, Jasmine just looks slightly annoyed. She glances in the rearview mirror and lets out a dramatic sigh. She tells her audience that some people just do not know how to drive and that she has to pull over to let a speeding police car pass her. She casually signals and pulls my vehicle onto the wide gravel shoulder of the exit ramp, expecting the police cruiser to fly right past her. But the cruiser does not pass her. It pulls up directly behind her. And then another cruiser pulls up, aggressively blocking her in from the front. A third police vehicle swerves in to secure the perimeter. Jasmine looks at her phone camera, looking genuinely confused and slightly irritated. She mutters that the police must be looking for someone dangerous, and she hopes it does not make her late for her luncheon. She has absolutely no idea that she is the dangerous person they are looking for. Because this is not a routine traffic stop for a broken taillight or an expired registration. This is a high-risk felony stop for a stolen luxury motor vehicle, and the suspects are considered potentially hostile. Jasmine rolls down her window, intending to give the officers a piece of her mind about delaying her busy schedule. Before she can even speak, a loud booming voice echoes from the police loudspeaker. The officer commands the driver to turn off the engine and throw the keys out of the window immediately. Jasmine freezes. Her designer sunglasses slide down her nose as pure panic finally sets in. She stammers into her live stream, asking her followers what is happening. The officer repeats the command much louder. Turn off the engine and throw the keys out the window right now. Keep your hands where we can see them. Jasmine, trembling violently, complies. She throws my spare key onto the gravel. The next few minutes of the live stream are a chaotic blur of audio and visual humiliation. The police officers approach the vehicle with their weapons drawn, which is standard protocol for a felony grand theft auto stop. The commanding officer loudly orders Jasmine to open the door from the outside, keeping her hands completely visible. Jasmine is crying hysterically now, mascara running down her face, completely destroying her perfect aesthetic. She steps out of the car, sobbing and begging the officers to listen to her. She screams that it is a misunderstanding and that the car belongs to her sister-in-law. But the officers do not care about family drama. They only care that the vehicle identification number matches a freshly stolen car report. They order her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. Right there on the shoulder of the highway, with cars driving past, and her phone broadcasting every single second to the internet, Jasmine is aggressively placed in heavy steel handcuffs. The live stream captures the sound of the handcuffs clicking shut. It captures the officer reciting her rights, telling her she has the right to remain silent. It is a right she absolutely should have exercised, but she just keeps screaming that she is a social media influencer and they cannot do this to her. The comment section of her live stream is absolutely exploding. Thousands of her loyal followers are watching their favorite luxury lifestyle guru get arrested for felony car theft in real time. The comments shift from adoration to absolute shock and mockery. People are recording the screen, taking screenshots, and sharing the link across multiple platforms. In a matter of minutes, her carefully curated online persona is completely obliterated. The internet never forgets, and Jasmine has just provided them with the ultimate viral arrest video. An officer leans into the car to retrieve her belongings and notices the phone still broadcasting. He simply reaches over and ends the live stream, cutting off the feed to her thousands of stunned viewers. Jasmine is escorted to the back of the police cruiser, crying uncontrollably as she is shoved into the back seat. She watches through the wire mesh window as a large commercial tow truck slowly arrives on the scene. The police officially impound my vehicle, lifting it carefully onto the flatbed to be returned to me. Jasmine was supposed to be walking into a lavish country club to sip champagne with her rich friends. Instead, she is being driven directly to the downtown county jail to be booked and fingerprinted for grand theft auto. When I received the official call from the police confirming that my vehicle was safely recovered and the suspect was securely in custody, I was sitting peacefully on my sofa drinking a fresh glass of cold, sparkling water. The dispatcher politely informed me I could pick up my car the following morning. I thanked him very sincerely and ended the call feeling a very deep and satisfying sense of absolute final closure. The absolute peace I felt sitting on my living room sofa did not last very long. I knew my family would not simply accept defeat. They had been operating under the assumption that they could control me through intimidation and guilt for my entire life. Jasmine being arrested on a public highway and dragged into the county jail was not a wake-up call for them. It was an absolute declaration of war. About an hour after I received the confirmation call from the police dispatcher, I heard the distinct sound of heavy tires screeching onto my concrete driveway. I did not need to get up and look out the window to know who had just arrived at my home. I picked up my tablet from the coffee table and opened my home security application. The 4K high-definition video feed from my doorbell camera instantly popped up on the bright screen. It was my father, Thomas. He had clearly driven straight over the moment Brandon called him in an absolute panic about Jasmine's humiliating arrest. Thomas slammed his car door so incredibly hard, I could hear the metallic bang right through the thick walls of my house. His face was a dark, furious shade of red, and the thick veins in his neck were visibly bulging. He marched up my front walkway with heavy, aggressive steps, looking absolutely furious. This was the man who had always demanded absolute respect and quiet decorum from me since childhood. Now he looked entirely unhinged. He did not politely ring the doorbell. He balled his large hand into a tight fist and began violently pounding on the heavy wooden frame of my front door. The terrible sound echoed loudly through my quiet house, like a sudden physical assault. "Danielle, open this front door right now," he screamed at the absolute top of his lungs. "I know you are hiding in there. You open this door, and you look me in the eye." I did not move a single inch from my comfortable spot on the sofa. I simply turned up the digital volume on my tablet and watched his completely unfiltered meltdown unfold in real time. He hit the door again, even harder this time, violently rattling the decorative glass panes. "You are going to call the police station right this very second, and you are going to tell them you made a terrible mistake," he ordered, his voice cracking loudly with rage. "You are going to officially drop those ridiculous auto theft charges against Jasmine immediately. Do you have any real idea what you have just done? You have completely ruined her public reputation. She is currently sitting in a dirty holding cell like a common criminal because you are throwing a childish temper tantrum over a spare set of keys. You are going to fix this terrible mess right now, or I swear to you there will be severe and lasting consequences." He was literally demanding that I commit federal perjury to save his daughter-in-law from the highly public consequences of grand theft auto. When I did not answer the door or respond to his screaming, his anger escalated from demands to direct explicit threats. He leaned his face right into the camera lens, entirely unaware that every single micro-expression and every loud word was being recorded in crystal-clear audio and video. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat!" Thomas snarled, pointing a shaking finger directly at the doorbell. "If you do not drop these charges and pay off that loan by Monday morning, I will personally make sure you lose everything. I will destroy your life. I will call the senior partners at your corporate firm and tell them you are completely mentally unstable. I will tell them you are harassing your family and filing false police reports. I will drag your professional name through the mud until you do not have a career or a single friend left in this city." He continued to scream terrible obscenities and hurl insults, calling me incredibly vile names that no father should ever call his daughter. He was finally showing his true colors. The sophisticated, successful businessman mask had completely fallen off, revealing the desperate, toxic bully underneath. I sat there watching the screen, feeling entirely disconnected from the angry man on my porch. I was not the scared little girl he could easily intimidate anymore. I was a professional auditor gathering irrefutable evidence. Thomas stood on my porch for 10 full minutes, continuing his unhinged tirade until he finally exhausted himself. He gave the heavy front door one last violent kick before turning around and storming back to his vehicle. I watched him throw his car into reverse and speed away, leaving thick black tire marks on the concrete pavement. The moment his car disappeared down the suburban street, I calmly exported the entire digital video file from my security application. The footage was absolutely perfect. The audio was incredibly crisp, capturing every single threat and direct admission of extortion. He had deliberately come to my private house to aggressively intimidate me into dropping legitimate felony charges, which legally constitutes witness tampering and active obstruction of justice. I drafted a brief, highly professional email to Detective Miller, the lead investigator handling my identity theft case. I attached the high-definition video file and explained that the primary suspect in the federal fraud investigation had just arrived at my private residence to threaten my safety. I hit send and closed my laptop. That meltdown was exactly what the police needed. It completely destroyed any possible defense my father might have tried to build about being a misunderstood traditional family man. The footage served as the ultimate catalyst. It legally proved he was a volatile, dangerous individual attempting to extort a federal witness. By losing his temper on my front porch, Thomas had just guaranteed that the federal arrest warrants for his crimes would be expedited immediately. The video footage of my father screaming on my porch was the final catalyst the authorities needed to escalate their response. By Monday morning, the federal machinery I had set into motion was operating at maximum speed and with absolute precision. While I was sitting comfortably at my desk in my quiet corporate office drinking my morning tea, the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation made their first highly coordinated move. They did not send a polite warning letter or a gentle subpoena in the mail. They executed a massive tactical financial strike against my brother and his completely fraudulent empire. Brandon had always bragged about his downtown office space. It was a flashy, expensive loft where he pretended to be a cryptocurrency genius manipulating digital markets. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, a large team of federal agents walked right through the glass doors of his company. They did not ask for permission, and they did not wait for his lawyer to arrive. They immediately seized his network servers, his physical hard drives, and dozens of boxes containing his heavily fabricated ledger documents. My brother was not even awake yet when the agents completely dismantled the fake illusion he had spent years trying to build. But the physical raid on his office building was only the beginning of the nightmare for them. The real devastation happened quietly in the digital banking world. Because I had handed Detective Miller the exact routing numbers and the specific offshore account details, the authorities knew exactly where the stolen money was hiding. Federal agents simultaneously executed a total and complete asset freeze on every single financial account connected to Brandon and his wife. They froze their joint checking accounts, their high-yield savings accounts, and their corporate credit lines. Most importantly, they locked down the secret offshore Caribbean account, where Jasmine was hiding the $150,000. The money that my parents had illegally secured by mortgaging their family home was entirely trapped. The money that was supposed to fund Jasmine's luxurious life was instantly locked behind an impenetrable federal firewall. They could not move a single penny without federal approval. The massive debt they tried to force onto me was now entirely their own burden to bear, and the government was watching every single financial move they tried to make. The trap I had carefully set was now completely closed around them. Jasmine was completely unaware of this massive federal sweep. She had just been released from the county jail after spending a horrific weekend sleeping on a thin mattress in a cold holding cell. My parents had scrambled all weekend to pull together the cash to post her bail, completely exhausting whatever small liquid funds they still had left in their personal accounts. When Jasmine finally walked out of the police station, she was absolutely furious, completely humiliated and desperate to regain control of her perfect public narrative. In her incredibly distorted reality, she genuinely believed that the stolen car incident was just a temporary, annoying setback. She thought she could just go home, take a long, hot shower, put on her expensive designer clothes, and pretend nothing terrible had actually happened. She genuinely believed that the $150,000 sitting in her secret offshore account made her totally invincible. She thought she was rich enough to outrun the consequences of grand theft auto. She honestly believed that her massive social media following and her fake wealth would shield her from the brutal reality of the criminal justice system that was rapidly closing in on her husband. To self-soothe and rebuild her shattered ego, Jasmine decided to do exactly what she always did when she felt stressed or challenged. She went shopping. She ordered an expensive private car service because she obviously no longer had a vehicle of her own, and she directed the driver to her favorite high-end designer boutique in the luxury shopping district downtown. She walked into the bright, pristine store wearing massive, oversized sunglasses to hide her swollen, red, crying eyes. She immediately demanded exclusive VIP service from the sales associates, treating them like her personal servants. She walked around the showroom gathering armfuls of expensive silk blouses, imported Italian leather shoes, and a brand new designer handbag that cost more than most hardworking people make in an entire year. She was putting on a desperate performance, trying to prove to the boutique staff, and mostly to herself, that she was still a wealthy, elite social media influencer. She carried the massive pile of luxury goods to the sleek glass checkout counter, holding her head high and looking completely ready to carelessly swipe her heavy metal platinum credit card like she had done so many times before. The young sales associate smiled politely as she began ringing up the items. The total on the digital screen quickly exceeded $8,000. Jasmine confidently handed over her shiny credit card, not even bothering to glance at the staggering price. The associate inserted the card into the electronic payment machine. A few tense seconds passed in absolute silence. Then the machine beeped loudly, displaying a bright red error message on its small screen. The associate looked slightly apologetic and politely told Jasmine that the card had been declined. Jasmine scoffed, rolling her eyes loudly in dramatic disbelief. She told the associate to run the card again, claiming the machine must be broken because she had absolutely unlimited funds. The associate nodded and ran it a second time. It was declined again. Jasmine snatched the card back from the counter and reached aggressively into her designer wallet, pulling out a different bank card attached to their primary joint checking account. She slammed it onto the glass counter, her face flushing with deep embarrassment. The associate ran the second card through the machine. It was also immediately declined, causing the other wealthy customers in the boutique to turn around and stare. Panic finally began to creep into Jasmine's loud, demanding voice. She stepped away from the counter, pulling out her cell phone to aggressively dial her premium banking concierge line. She fully intended to scream at a customer service representative and demand to know why her accounts were locked. After navigating the automated system, a serious representative finally came on the line. The representative calmly informed Jasmine that all of her accounts, both domestic and international, had been completely frozen by a direct federal mandate. Jasmine stood entirely frozen in the middle of the luxury boutique, surrounded by expensive clothes. The representative explained very clearly that her husband was currently the subject of an active federal investigation for wire fraud, identity theft, and massive embezzlement. The offshore account holding the $150,000 was completely inaccessible. The crushing reality of her true situation crashed down on her shoulders. Her husband was completely broke. They were under severe federal investigation. She possessed absolutely zero access to her stolen lifestyle funds right now. She dropped her useless plastic credit cards onto the pristine hardwood floor, turned around, and ran out of the store, feeling absolute total disgrace. While Jasmine was experiencing the crushing reality of her frozen bank accounts downtown, my parents were sitting inside their large suburban home, completely oblivious to the legal avalanche that was currently heading straight for their front door. Thomas and Carol had spent the entire weekend scrambling to pull together enough cash to bail Jasmine out of the county jail. They were exhausted and highly stressed, but they still clung to a very dangerous false sense of security regarding their own living situation. They knew the private equity firm had officially seized the property, but like many people who are entirely ignorant of how aggressive corporate real estate works, my parents assumed the foreclosure eviction process would take several months or even a full year. They genuinely believed they had plenty of time to sit in their comfortable living room, drink their morning coffee, and figure out a way to manipulate me into paying off their massive debt. They had absolutely no idea that the anonymous corporate entity that had purchased their home at the public auction just a few days prior was actually my blind trust. And they certainly did not know that I had instructed my legal team to execute the most aggressive, expedited eviction process legally permissible in our state. At exactly noon on that same Monday, a plain white sedan pulled into my parents' long driveway. A tall man in a simple gray suit stepped out holding a thick manila envelope. He was a licensed county process server, and he was there to deliver a very harsh dose of reality. My mother Carol opened the front door expecting to see a delivery driver dropping off a package. Instead, the man asked to confirm her identity and the identity of my father. Thomas, hearing the unfamiliar voice, stepped out of his home office and came to the front foyer. The moment they both verbally confirmed their names, the man handed Thomas the heavy envelope, stated that they had been officially served, and walked promptly back to his vehicle. Thomas ripped open the envelope, feeling a sudden wave of anxiety. He pulled out the official court-stamped documents, and his face instantly drained of all color. It was a formal 3-day notice to vacate the premises. The legal paperwork clearly stated that the property had been successfully sold at auction to a private corporate buyer, and the new owner was demanding immediate possession of the residence. If they did not completely vacate the property within exactly 72 hours, the county sheriff's department would physically remove them and all of their belongings from the house. Carol snatched the papers from his trembling hands and read the bold print herself. She let out a loud, dramatic gasp, clutching her chest, as if she were having a physical medical emergency. "This has to be a mistake," she stammered, her voice rising in pitch. "The bank cannot just kick us out into the street in 3 days." We have lived in this house for over 30 years. But the bank no longer owned the house, and the new corporate owner had absolutely no emotional attachment to their 30 years of memories. Thomas tried to read through the complex legal jargon looking for a loophole, but the documents were entirely ironclad. The notice explicitly warned that any attempt to vandalize or damage the property before leaving would result in immediate criminal prosecution by the new owner. They were completely trapped. The reality of their incredibly foolish decisions was finally crashing down on them. They had illegally mortgaged their fully paid-off home to fund a failing crypto business and a luxury influencer lifestyle for their son and daughter-in-law. Now they were entirely broke. Their golden child son was under federal investigation. Their daughter-in-law had a felony arrest record, and they were about to be physically thrown onto the street by the police. In a normal family, this would be the moment of profound regret and intense self-reflection. But my father is not a normal man. His intense narcissism and massive ego simply would not allow him to accept defeat. Instead of realizing the incredible magnitude of his mistakes, Thomas simply pivoted to his next victim. He looked at his crying wife and told her to stop sobbing immediately. He straightened his posture, projecting a ridiculous aura of fake confidence. "We do not need this old house anyway," he declared loudly, waving his hand dismissively at the walls. "We are not going to let some faceless corporate real estate company intimidate us." Carol looked at him in total bewilderment, asking him where on earth they were supposed to go with no money and no credit. Thomas smiled a very dark and highly entitled smile. "We are going to pack our things and we are going to move into Danielle's house," he announced smoothly. "She has that massive 4-bedroom property sitting completely empty. She is a single woman with absolutely no children and no real responsibilities. She owes us for raising her and putting a roof over her head all those years. We are her parents and family takes care of family." He completely ignored the fact that he had just screamed obscenities at my doorbell camera and forged my signature on a massive federal loan. He genuinely convinced himself and his desperate wife that they could just pack up a moving truck drive over to my property and bully their way through my front door. He believed that if they stood on my porch with all their luggage, I would eventually cave to the social pressure and let them move in permanently. They assumed my boundaries were weak and that my need for family approval would ultimately override my common sense. They were about to learn the hardest lesson of their entire lives because I was already 10 steps ahead of them. Their arrogance was blinding them to reality. They were walking right into my perfect trap. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the absolute climax of their incredible delusion finally rolled right up to my front door. I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing a set of quarterly financial reports, when I heard the unmistakable heavy rumble of a large commercial engine shifting gears. I looked out my front window and could hardly believe what I was seeing. A massive orange and white rental moving truck was backing slowly into my private driveway, completely blocking my garage. My parents had actually done it. They had completely ignored the brutal reality of their situation and decided to force their way into my life. The engine cut off and the heavy doors of the truck swung open. My father Thomas stepped out of the driver's seat looking exhausted, but still wearing his ridiculous mask of absolute authority. My mother Carol climbed out of the passenger side looking entirely disheveled, holding a small designer dog carrier. Then the back doors of the truck's cab opened. My brother Brandon stepped out, followed closely by his wife Jasmine. Jasmine was no longer wearing her expensive designer clothes. She was dressed in plain gray sweatpants, looking absolutely miserable after her horrific weekend in the county jail and the subsequent freezing of all her stolen assets. They stood together in my driveway, surrounded by a massive pile of cardboard boxes and expensive leather suitcases. They had been legally evicted from their home because of their own massive financial crimes, and instead of taking responsibility, they had packed up their entire lives and brought their mess directly to my doorstep. I watched them through the wooden blinds of my living room window as they began to gather their belongings. Thomas began barking orders at Brandon, telling him to grab the heaviest suitcases. Brandon complained, rubbing his face and looking incredibly sorry for himself. Jasmine refused to carry anything at all, simply crossing her arms and glaring at my beautiful four-bedroom house as if it were a hotel that had somehow lost her reservation. Carol fussed with her bags, looking around my quiet, upscale suburban neighborhood to see if any of my neighbors were watching this embarrassing spectacle. They quickly formed a united front. Thomas took the lead, marching aggressively up my manicured front walkway. Carol followed closely behind him, clutching her purse like a shield. Brandon and Jasmine dragged their feet, but stayed right behind my parents, forming a solid wall of toxic family pressure. They marched up the steps onto my wide covered porch, completely taking over the space. They were operating under the profound illusion that the traditional rules of family obligation would magically erase the fact that they had committed severe federal felonies against me. They honestly believed that because we shared the same blood, I was somehow legally and morally required to absorb the devastating consequences of their terrible choices. They stood on my welcome mat, breathing heavily from the effort of carrying their luggage, fully prepared to launch the ultimate emotional ambush. Thomas did not bother to ring the doorbell this time. He raised his heavy fist and began violently pounding on the solid wood of my front door. The sound echoed through the entire house, but I did not jump. "Danielle, open this door right now!" he shouted, his voice easily penetrating the thick walls. "We know you are in there, and we are not leaving." He hit the door again, even harder. "The bank completely locked us out of our house this morning. We lost our beautiful home because of your incredible selfishness and your refusal to help your own family in our time of need. You forced us out onto the street." His ability to project the blame onto me was truly staggering. He was literally standing on my porch demanding sanctuary from an eviction that was entirely caused by his own fraudulent second mortgage. "You owe us this, Danielle, my mother." Carol chimed in, her voice shrill and demanding. "We gave you a wonderful life, and now it is your turn to take care of us. We brought our things, and we are taking the guest bedrooms. You are going to let your brother and his wife stay here too until they get back on their feet. Open the door and let your family inside right now." They stood there completely united in their toxic entitlement. They were using every single manipulation tactic they had ever taught me, trying to trigger the deep feelings of guilt and obligation that used to control my every move. The tension radiating from the front porch was absolutely palpable. I could see them clearly on my security camera monitor. They were standing shoulder to shoulder, a united family front, fully expecting me to break down. They expected me to be standing there crying, apologizing for being so stubborn, and begging them for forgiveness. They believed I would quietly step aside, let them drag their heavy boxes across my pristine hardwood floors, and completely surrender my peaceful sanctuary to their chaotic, fraudulent lives. In their minds, I was just a disobedient child who had finally been pushed to her absolute limit and was now ready to submit to their authority out of sheer, overwhelming guilt. I stood in my quiet hallway just a few feet away from the heavy front door. I took a deep, calming breath, feeling the smooth fabric of my tailored blazer. I felt an incredible surge of absolute power coursing through my veins. I slowly reached out and calmly rested my bare hand on the cool metal of the heavy deadbolt. They had no idea that the house they had just been evicted from was now legally owned by me. They had no idea that federal arrest warrants for their massive crimes had already been signed by a judge earlier that morning. They had knocked on my front door expecting a victim. They were about to come face to face with their absolute ruin. The violent pounding on my front door echoed through the quiet hallway of my home. Thomas was convinced his physical aggression would break my spirit. He assumed I was cowering in the living room, paralyzed by my family standing on my porch. He was wrong. I did not feel fear. I stood calmly in the foyer, taking a deep breath to steady my heart. I was not wearing sweatpants. I had deliberately dressed for this occasion. I was wearing a sharply tailored black blazer, a white silk blouse, and trousers. I looked like a corporate auditor stepping into a boardroom to finalize a hostile takeover. In my right hand, I held a thick manila envelope that contained the absolute destruction of their backup plan. I ran my thumb over the smooth paper, feeling the heavy weight of the legal documents inside. I grasped the cool metal of the deadbolt and turned it with a loud click. I pulled the heavy wooden door open and stepped squarely into the center of the doorframe. I planted my feet firmly, creating an impenetrable physical barrier between my sanctuary and their chaos. The bright sunlight hit my face as I looked out at the four of them. My father puffed out his chest and took a heavy step forward, fully intending to push right past me into my house. He brought his shoulder forward, expecting me to yield the space to him like I had always done when I was little. I did not move an inch. I stood my ground, holding the frame with my left hand and the manila envelope with my right. Thomas collided slightly with my shoulder, but I held firm, forcing him to abruptly stop right there on the welcome mat. He looked genuinely startled by my physical resistance. Behind him, Carol was clutching her dog carrier and heavy purse, trying to peer into my living room. Brandon and Jasmine stood down the steps surrounded by their massive pile of luggage, looking exhausted and miserable. "Move out of the way, Danielle," my father commanded, using his deepest authoritative voice. "We have had a disastrous day and we are entirely exhausted. The bank locked us out of our home and we need to get these boxes inside your house right now." He did not ask for permission. He did not offer an apology for forging my signature or threatening my career. He demanded entry as if my property was a hotel. My mother nodded along with his ridiculous demands. She told me to stop being stubborn and to let my family inside so we could fix this terrible mess together. They stood there completely united in their incredible delusion. They packed up their entire lives and driven a moving truck to my house, fully expecting me to surrender my peace to accommodate their criminal mistakes. They expected me to drop my boundaries, apologize for causing them stress, and absorb their financial ruin. They were waiting for the inevitable moment when my resolve would break and I would step aside to let them take over my life. I looked at my father. I looked at my mother. I looked down the steps at my cowardly brother and his ruined influencer wife. I felt absolute ice flowing through my veins. The air between us was heavy with their toxic expectations. I did not yell or scream or show even a trace of anger. I looked directly into my father and his angry red face and delivered the two words that would completely shatter their world. "Too late," I said, my voice perfectly steady and incredibly cold. Thomas furrowed his brow, clearly not comprehending what I had just said. He asked me what on earth I was talking about and demanded again that I move out of the doorway. I smiled, a very small, very sharp smile. I told them they were incredibly late. I explained that they could not move into this beautiful 4-bedroom house because I no longer owned it. I told them that exactly 3 days ago, I sold this property to a wealthy overseas corporate buyer who made an incredible all-cash offer. The closing process was completely finalized yesterday afternoon. The funds are already safely secured in my private trust account, and the legal deed has been completely transferred to the new owner. I stood in the doorway and watched the absolute sheer horror wash over my father. I continued delivering the devastating facts with corporate precision. I explained that the only reason the house looked quiet today was because professional movers packed up my major furniture and loaded it through the back garage doors earlier this morning. I told them I was simply finishing up some final paperwork before moving out of the state in exactly 2 hours. The new owner's property management team is scheduled to arrive here at 4:00 this afternoon to change the exterior locks and activate a new commercial security system. If you try to force your way inside this house, you will be actively trespassing on private corporate property, and they will absolutely have you arrested. The silence that fell over my front porch was deafening. The arrogant, demanding posture completely vanished from my father. His broad shoulders slumped, and his mouth fell slightly open as the catastrophic reality of my words finally penetrated his massive ego. Their perfect backup plan had just instantly evaporated into thin air. They had bet their survival on moving into my house, and now that house belonged to a faceless overseas corporation. My mother Carol dropped her heavy leather purse right onto the concrete porch. The loud thud echoed in the terrible silence. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, unable to form a coherent sentence. She finally realized that her manipulation tactics had failed, and she was officially homeless. Brandon stumbled against a cardboard box. Jasmine let out a muffled sob of pure despair. They were completely paralyzed with nowhere to run. My family stood on the concrete porch, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of what I had just told them. They had driven a massive rental truck to my property, expecting a reluctant welcome, but instead they found a corporate fortress that was entirely off-limits. I watched my father Thomas open and close his mouth repeatedly, trying to find a way to argue with a legally binding real estate transaction. He simply could not process the fact that his perfect safety net had been completely eliminated. My mother Carol was trembling, gripping the handle of her dog carrier so tightly her knuckles were completely white. They were essentially homeless, sitting on my porch, with all of their worldly possessions packed into a truck they had nowhere to unload. But I was not finished. The panic setting into their eyes was just the preliminary phase of their absolute destruction. I had not stood my ground simply to tell them to drive away and find a hotel. I stood there to deliver the ultimate receipt. I looked down at the thick manila envelope resting securely in my right hand. I carefully unclasped the metal tab and opened the flap. The crisp sound of the thick legal paper sliding out of the envelope seemed to echo loudly in the incredibly tense silence of the afternoon. I pulled out a heavy stack of documents stamped with official county clerk seals. I held the first document up so the bright afternoon sunlight illuminated the bold black text. "Do you remember the public bank auction that took place on Friday morning?" I asked, my voice projecting an eerie calm over the group. "The auction where the private equity firm sold the beautiful suburban home you lived in for 30 years. Thomas stared at the paper, his face twisting in massive confusion. He nodded very slowly, clearly, not understanding how I knew about the specific details of their foreclosure timeline. Well, I continued, keeping my eyes locked directly onto his. I monitored that auction very closely. I watched 3 different corporate real estate investors place their bids trying to buy your house for pennies on the dollar. But they did not win the auction. An anonymous corporate limited liability company placed a massive all-cash bid and completely secured the property. My father sneered slightly, his old arrogance trying to surface. "What does that matter to us?" he snapped aggressively. "Some faceless corporation bought the house and kicked us out." "That is exactly why we are here, Danielle." I smiled, letting the cold reality of my next words sink in. "It is not a faceless corporation," I replied smoothly. "That limited liability company belongs entirely to my private blind trust. I used the money you demanded I give to Brandon to legally purchase the deed to your house. I own the property completely." The absolute shock that washed over my family was incredible to witness. I handed the official property deed directly to my father. He took it with trembling hands, staring at the registration details that clearly linked the purchasing company to my primary financial estate. I leaned forward slightly, ensuring every single word landed with maximum impact. "You looked me in the eye and disowned me on Thursday night," I said, my tone dropping to a chilling whisper. "I legally became your landlord on Friday morning, and I was the one who officially evicted you today. The 3-day notice to vacate that the process server handed you a few hours ago was not from the bank. It was from me. You are not standing on my porch because the bank kicked you out. You are standing here because I personally ordered your removal from my property." Thomas stumbled backward a few inches, as if I had physically struck him in the chest. The deed slipped from his fingers and fluttered down onto the welcome mat. Carol let out a high-pitched wail of absolute despair, realizing that the daughter she had emotionally abused for decades was the anonymous force that had just rendered her entirely homeless. But the financial checkmate was only half of the punishment. I reached into the manila envelope one last time and pulled out the final set of documents. These were not real estate papers. These were formal notices from the federal justice system. I held them out toward my father and my brother Brandon, who had been standing completely silent at the bottom of the steps. "While I was securing the deed to your house, I was also visiting the downtown police precinct," I explained, watching their eyes widen in renewed terror. I handed the federal indictment notices for the $100,000 forged line of credit to Thomas. I know you forged my signature, Dad. I have the forensic proof, the bank records, and the recorded confession Mom gave me at the coffee shop on Saturday. I filed formal federal charges for identity theft and wire fraud against you. These notices confirm that the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service have fully adopted the case. Brandon let out a loud gasp, finally understanding why his wife Jasmine had her bank accounts completely frozen earlier that morning. You did not just steal my money, I stated clearly, my voice echoing with absolute finality. You stole my identity, and you committed a massive federal felony to fund a fake lifestyle. The sheer weight of the legal and financial checkmate crushed their arrogance entirely. There were no more threats to make. There were no more manipulation tactics to deploy. Thomas fell to his knees on the concrete porch, completely broken and defeated. The empire of lies he had built was completely demolished, and he was the one who handed me the hammer. I watched them break apart, feeling absolutely nothing. The massive iron trap was successfully closed. There was no escape path left for them to take. They were completely ruined forever by their incredibly bad choices. The heavy silence that had fallen over my front porch was suddenly broken by the loud wail of approaching sirens. The sound pierced through the quiet neighborhood, growing louder and more intense with every passing second. Before my family could even begin to process the devastating legal documents I had just handed them, bright red and blue lights began flashing rapidly against the side of their massive moving truck. Two sleek police cruisers aggressively turned into my driveway, completely blocking the rental truck from moving. The neighbors started stepping out onto their front lawns, whispering to each other, trying to see the incredible commotion. Thomas turned around, his face completely pale as he watched the officers step out of their vehicles. For a brief, completely delusional moment, my father actually believed the police were there to help him. He probably thought he could use his loud, authoritative voice to force them to make me let him inside. But the heavily armed police officers did not walk up the driveway to mediate a family dispute. They moved swiftly with strict, tactical precision. Leading the group was Detective Miller, the exact same detective I had spoken to at the Financial Crimes Division. He was holding a clipboard, looking directly at my father. Thomas puffed out his chest and walked down the concrete porch steps, putting on his very best fake smile. "Officer, I am so glad you are here," he said, projecting his loud, confident voice. "My daughter is having a mental breakdown, and we simply need to get our belongings inside her house." Detective Miller did not smile back. He did not acknowledge the ridiculous lie. He simply looked at the photograph attached to his clipboard and then looked back at my father. "Are you Thomas?" he asked, his voice carrying a heavy tone of absolute legal authority. Thomas nodded, looking confused by the harsh reception. "Yes, I am," he replied. Detective Miller immediately unclipped the heavy metal handcuffs from his utility belt. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," he commanded loudly. "You are under arrest for aggravated identity theft and felony forgery." The fake smile vanished from my father's face, replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. He tried to take a step backward, stammering that there must be a terrible mistake. He insisted he was a respected local businessman and a generous pillar of the suburban community. But the officers did not care about his arrogant excuses. Two officers grabbed his arms, forcing them behind his back and tightly securing the steel handcuffs around his wrists. The loud metallic click of the cuffs locking into place echoed through the driveway, completely destroying his pristine public image forever. He was publicly humiliated right in front of the entire watching neighborhood. Brandon watched his father get pushed against the side of the police cruiser and absolutely panicked. The golden child, who had never faced a real consequence in his life, started backing away toward the street, trying to create distance between himself and the police. He tried to hide behind our mother Carol, using her as a physical human shield, but Detective Miller was already pointing directly at him. "Brandon, you are also under arrest," the detective shouted over the noise of the police radios. "The charges are federal wire fraud and deliberate embezzlement." Two more officers quickly moved up the driveway, cutting off any escape route. Brandon did not try to argue like his father. Instead, he completely broke down. He started crying hysterically, begging the officers not to take him away, claiming it was all a big misunderstanding, and he was just trying to save his technology startup. He looked up at me standing calmly on the porch and pleaded with me to tell the police to stop. He wanted me to save him one last time. I just looked down at him and slowly shook my head. The officers grabbed his arms firmly, ignoring his loud sobbing. They placed him in handcuffs and marched him down the driveway right past his expensive luggage and the boxes containing the ruins of his completely fraudulent life. The golden boy was finally facing the harsh reality of the world. Jasmine watched her fake empire crumble. Seeing her husband secured in the car, she realized the truth. There was no more money. The offshore account was frozen. Her home was gone. Her husband was going to prison, and she would be indicted next. Jasmine only cared about money and status. Seeing Brandon could no longer provide either, she made a selfish calculation. She did not cry. Instead, she angrily pulled her large diamond ring off her finger. She marched up to the cruiser and aggressively threw the ring, hitting him in the chest. "I am done with you!" she screamed, her voice full of absolute venom. "You ruined my life." She ordered a ride-share and completely abandoned her husband, walking away without looking back. My mother, Carol, was now left entirely alone. She stood in the driveway surrounded by black garbage bags filled with her clothes. She watched her husband and beloved son get driven away in the police cruisers. She watched her wealthy daughter-in-law flee the scene. She slowly turned and looked up at me, still standing completely untouched on the porch. The sheer gravity of her situation hit her at once. She was completely broke, entirely homeless, and her family was destroyed. Her legs gave out and she collapsed onto the concrete curb, sitting next to the trash bags. She began crying hysterically, begging me for mercy. She pleaded with me to open the door and save her from this nightmare. I looked down at the woman who had enabled my abuse for 30 years. I stood there and listened to her desperate begging. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of sympathy. I found absolutely nothing. I stared down at her without a single drop of empathy. The justice she deserved had finally arrived. 6 months have passed since that chaotic afternoon on my front porch. I am sitting in my new high-rise office in downtown Chicago, looking out at the beautiful skyline over the lake. Moving out of my hometown was the best decision I could have ever made. I transferred to the corporate headquarters of my auditing firm and received a substantial promotion for my work on the complex merger I was auditing during that terrible week. My new life is incredibly peaceful. I wake up every morning without the heavy dread of family obligation hanging over my head. The air in Chicago feels lighter, and for the first time in 33 years, I am living entirely for myself. I do not have to check my phone constantly, fearing a manipulative text message from my mother or an angry demand from my father. I have built a wonderful new community of friends and colleagues who respect my boundaries and value my presence. They do not view me as a financial safety net or a backup plan. They simply appreciate me for who I am as a person. The contrast between my chosen family here and the biological family I left behind is truly staggering. Let me tell you what happened to the property I purchased from the bank. I did not keep my parents' old house. The day after they were arrested, I handed the keys over to a premier real estate investment group. We completely gutted the interior, removed all the outdated fixtures, and transformed it into a modern luxury home. Because I had purchased it at a massive discount during the public auction, the profit margin was absolutely incredible. We sold the flipped house 3 months later to a lovely young couple starting their family. I walked away with a net profit of over $200,000. But I did not put that money into my retirement account or use it to buy luxury goods. I took the entire profit from the sale of the house that funded their toxic behavior and used it to establish a permanent trust. I created a dedicated financial literacy scholarship fund designed specifically for young women from disadvantaged backgrounds who want to study finance and accounting. I wanted to take the ultimate symbol of my parents' greed and turn it into a powerful tool for independence. Education and financial literacy were the exact tools that allowed me to escape my abusive family. By funding these scholarships, I am giving other young women the knowledge and power to protect themselves from financial manipulation and toxic control. As for my biological family, the justice system has been incredibly thorough. My father Thomas avoided federal prison by pleading guilty to all charges and cooperating fully with the investigators. He lost his prestigious job, his country club membership, and his entire social standing. He is currently serving 5 years of strict federal probation and is legally required to pay massive financial restitution. Every single month, a portion of whatever meager income he can scrape together goes directly to the private equity firm to pay down the fraud he committed. My mother, Carol, could not handle the public humiliation or the sudden loss of her wealthy lifestyle. When the money completely vanished, so did her loyalty to my father. They filed for a bitter divorce 2 months ago. Carol is now living entirely alone in a very cramped studio apartment on the wrong side of town. She works as a receptionist at a small dental clinic just to pay her basic utility bills. She has tried to call me several times, leaving tearful voicemails begging for financial assistance or just a simple conversation. I have never answered a single call. I simply delete the voicemails and go about my day. I have absolutely no obligation to rescue the woman who willingly participated in my destruction. My brother Brandon is facing the harshest reality of them all, because he actively orchestrated the offshore embezzlement and committed wire fraud to hide the funds. His crimes carry mandatory minimum sentences. He is currently sitting in a federal holding facility awaiting his official trial date. His public defender has already advised him that he is looking at several years in a federal penitentiary. Jasmine completely disappeared after throwing her wedding ring at him. She filed for an expedited divorce citing his criminal behavior and completely abandoned him to save her own skin. She lost her influencer platform when the details of her stolen car arrest went viral, and she is currently facing her own secondary charges for receiving stolen funds. The fake empire they tried to build on my back has completely crumbled into dust. They gambled absolutely everything they had trying to break my spirit, and they lost spectacularly. I look back on that Thanksgiving dinner and realize it was the greatest gift they could have ever given me. Their sheer greed finally pushed me to shatter the illusion of our family. Blood does not entitle people to abuse you. It does not give anyone the right to cross your boundaries, steal your future, or demand your hard-earned resources. For years, I was conditioned to believe that true power meant keeping the peace and sacrificing my own happiness to keep my family intact. I now know that true power comes from protecting your peace at all costs. You are not required to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. Looking at those forged documents constantly reminded me that protecting my own future is not a crime. I am proud of the life I have meticulously built. I stood up to the toxic bullies disguised as parents, and I won back my absolute freedom. The ultimate revenge was never about seeing them in handcuffs. The ultimate revenge was realizing I never actually needed them at all. I am thriving now, and my story belongs entirely to me alone. This is the end of my long journey. If there is one profound lesson to take away from this story, it is that setting firm boundaries is an act of supreme self-care, not an act of selfishness. Society often conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, demanding unwavering loyalty regardless of how poorly we are treated. We are taught to endure emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and manipulation simply because the people hurting us share our bloodline. But this story completely dismantles that dangerous narrative. It proves that a title like mother or father does not grant anyone a free pass to destroy your mental health or steal your future. When you finally decide to stop setting yourself on fire to keep toxic people warm, you reclaim your power. It is terrifying to walk away from the only family dynamic you have ever known. But the peace waiting on the other side of that difficult decision is absolutely worth it. Your worth is not defined by your usefulness to those who exploit you. Your worth is inherent, and you deserve a life free from constant anxiety and conditional love. The moment you draw a line in the sand, you make room for genuine relationships built on mutual respect and actual support. Now, I want to turn the conversation over to all of you watching. Healing from family trauma is a long and deeply personal journey, and sharing our experiences can help others find the courage to take their first step. Have you ever had to legally or emotionally protect yourself from your own family? How have you successfully set boundaries against toxic relatives who refuse to respect your independence? Tell me your story in the comments section below. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories of reclaiming your peace today.